Protest action and demonstration in South Africa has existed for many years, with the most prominent being those of the 1970s against the apartheid government at the time. In more recent times, we've seen protests evolve and develop into trying to tackle social ills such as GBV and discrimination, advocate for access to education, and several other pressing matters. Over the past few weeks, several citizens, civil society organizations have either taken to or called for protest action against the ongoing electricity power cuts. Official opposition, the DA itself, will be marching to the ruling party's headquarters at Luthuli House on Wednesday against the ongoing power crisis and tariff hikes. But how effective is protest action, and what are other important elements needed to undertake a protest? Communications Officer at Right to Protest, Omhle Ntshingila, joins us now to explain. Omhle, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us. I mean, you would have heard there in my introduction the long history of mass movements, of demonstrations, of protests in South Africa, using them as a vehicle for change. But you look at today's social landscape, and there seems to be a bit of apathy when it comes to taking up that appetite to protest. Others argue that that's not entirely true, that South Africans in fact protest every day. We see them in our service delivery protests out on the streets. But what do you make of how South Africans utilize the protests in today's day and age?
I think protests, because of the type of history South Africa has had, plays a very important role in accessing any other rights that a South African can enjoy from their constitution, that the constitution gives them. And today's protests have really escalated from not only just focusing on national issues, but local issues, and intensified local narratives as well. We're starting to see more protests being covered by the media in communities rather than protests that are just focused on one particular issues, like you would have seen in post-apartheid South Africa, where issues were focused more on race. This in post-democratic South Africa, not post-democratic South Africa, but post-apartheid South Africa, we kind of see a trend where protests are more focused on really just the governance and the local issues that are taking place, even though right now we have protests that are really highlighting issues, national issues such as load shedding and ESCOM. But it's really refreshing to see how local narratives are really being covered by the media.
Yeah, indeed. On the issue of national issues and the national discourse, currently the ongoing power crisis, the tariff hikes that are set to go up in April have been very topical. We've seen growing calls from a number of civil society organizations trying to galvanize, trying to mobilize South Africans to take to the streets over these issues. Just this past Friday, Not in My Name, a civil society group embarked on such a protest. The numbers, however, weren't that great. The turnout wasn't the massive sort of national stage that we were anticipating. Why is that?
I think most of it is because of fragmentation when it comes to mobilization and communication between organizations that are organizing on the ground. We see a lot of people showing up when community organizers or those who are organizing protests are well trusted in the communities, and there's a sort of social contract between them and people who participate in protests. I don't think that people are despondent towards protests, because protests are happening in South Africa every single day. We have evaluating and monitoring systems that show that probably 8 protests that pertaining to service delivery are happening in South Africa every single day. And I think when people don't show up to hashtag protest, it seems as if South Africa is not protesting, but South Africa is protesting. It's just mostly a time of maybe just miscommunication in how organizers have organized that protest. But the people do show up to protest.
Yeah. You know, something else that was interesting when the calls were being made for the national shutdown was a very specific requirement that it not be in any way affiliated to any political party or organization. It was really an attempt to get citizens to stand up in one voice and in one accord and not be brought out or bussed out in their numbers because they are affiliated or are a card-carrying member of a particular political party. Do you think therein perhaps also lies a problem that a lot of South Africa's sort of fragmentation lies along political lines?
I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with political parties who participate in protests. I think what South Africans and communities do not appreciate is when political parties use real life and socio-economic issues that communities are going through for political gain. And that fragmentation then happens then when a political party calls for a protest, but communities do not appreciate their participation. Because in South Africa, we have a ruling party, yes, but almost each and every popular political party is part of the problem that most communities are facing. And fragmentation then of ideology also exists in our communities. And just fragmentation of social belonging is there, but is not as evident as what I just said before of communities really not appreciating their issues being used for political gain.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose maybe an example of that would be, for instance, this upcoming march by the Democratic Alliance to the ANC's headquarters at Luthuli House, which makes it, in terms of optics, look like one party gunning for another, as opposed to an official opposition party trying to address a national social issue by taking it rather to the seat of government and not necessarily to the headquarters of their opposing political party.
And you get to see how there's this own political narrative that is taking place in South Africa. And then this is when then the protest narrative, the real focus of a protest gets lost in all these political narratives that we see in South Africa. Communities are calling for better service delivery. And that's the whole point of why protests have been happening so far in 2023. There is an issue that we have with electricity in the country. And if political parties then use those issues for their own political gain, it then becomes a disadvantage to community protests, and community protests constantly being swallowed by these popular political party narratives that we see exist in the media right now.
Yeah, very quickly, Omhle, the legal parameters, legally what we are allowed to do when we are embarking on a protest and a demonstration. We know that it's a constitutional right for us to picket, but so often it turns violent. The 2021 July unrest, a classic example of how intensified mass movement turned into an economic upheaval for the country, one that we're still recovering from today. So what are those legal parameters when one is embarking on a protest?
Lucky for us as South Africans, we have quite a beautiful constitution that allows for spontaneous protests to take place in the country, meaning that you don't necessarily need to give notice for a protest. But ideally, as a Right to Protest project, we do encourage our clients or protesters to give notice to their local municipalities on when they'd like to protest and where is it that they would like to protest. So giving notice is not a permission-seeking exercise, but it is a form of courtesy that happens between the local government and the protesters. And once that protest happens, you then get called into a Section 4 meeting where the protesters and the local authorities then talk it out on how the protest will take place, when the protest will take place, and how then the local authorities will also protect protesters when they do protest. And this is something that we do not see happening on the ground. It's mostly police violence on protesters, when police's public order policing's main role at the protest is to make sure that there is order and there is protection of protesters during protest action.
Well, Omhle, thank you so much for joining us on our platform. That was a very insightful conversation. That was Communications Officer at Right to Protest, Omhle Ntshingila.